Edexcel, June 2021. This is the microeconomics paper, so paper 1. Let's get right on with it and let's get started with this section A. So going straight to the question, which of the following best describes these two statements above? So the question is essentially asking us whether these statements are positive or normative. Now, of course, this is a very early on year 12 concept, quite an easy concept as well, so let's run through it. So statement 1, since Poland joined the EU in 2004, over 1 million of its workforce has migrated to other countries in the EU. Now, of course, straight away I can identify this is a positive statement. Why is that? Positive statements can be tested and they usually include evidence. So the main pitfall on positive versus normative statements is that it does not matter if the statement is factually incorrect. As long as the statement can be tested, it's not an opinion, it is a positive statement. Let's have a look at statement 2. Many engineers have left Poland for higher paid jobs in other countries in the EU. Again, can we test this? Yes. Can we measure this? Can we measure how many engineers have left? Yes. Therefore, it is a positive statement. It does not include any sort of opinion. Thus, the answer for this question would be D, as they are both positive statements. And that is 1 mark there. Let's keep going to the next question. So we have a 4-mark question here. Explain question. Explain the likely impact of migration on the wage level of engineers in Poland. So we talk about in Poland specifically. So what has the stimulus told us about engineers in Poland? It's told us workers in Poland and many engineers have left. Therefore, many engineers have left. Let's simply just think about, and the easiest way to demonstrate this is a labour supply and demand diagram. So we have supply of labour and we have demand of labour. And if engineers are leaving Poland, what is going to happen to the supply of labour? Supply of labour is going to decrease. We have a decrease in supply of labour. Of course, that causes a shift inwards of supply from S to S plus 1. And like I said, this is a labour market diagram. So what's going to be on the axis? It's going to be wage on the y-axis, and then quantity of labour on the x-axis. So by engineers leaving Poland, let's see the effects we have. So we have, of course, a decrease in the quantity of engineers from QE to Q1, and then also, let's see what happens on the y-axis. Wage rate, it will go from WE to W1, which is an increase in wage. And why is that? Since now there's a shortage of engineers, therefore the engineers that have stayed have increased bargaining power. Therefore, with increased bargaining power, they can negotiate higher wages. As firms almost have no other option than to pay these higher wages to these engineers, since most of the engineers have left. But yeah, and always remember, in a 4-mark question, at least 1 mark, at least one, so it could be 2, but at least 1 mark is reserved for application. So how am I going to get the application? Of course, in the start of this question, we were given 2 statements, so this is a great bit of application we can use to pick up the application mark. And of course, with this question, to achieve the 4 marks, you would not have to draw this diagram out, but it's first thing that came to our mind. It explains the concept perfectly, so I think it's a great addition just to help you secure the marks. But like I said, migration leads to engineers leaving Poland. Give that a bit of application. Over 1 million workers have migrated. This leads to a reduction in supply. Then I've quoted the diagram from S to S plus 1, which means there is a shortage of engineers. And I've said where the shortage is. This increases those workers' bargaining powers. Thus, firms have to offer higher wages to these workers. And that is more than enough for 4 out of 4 marks. And that is how to get 5 out of 5 on that question 1. And let's keep going. So we have a bit of a diagram here. And let's just move to the question. So with reference to the information provided, draw a supply and demand diagram to show why the price of cobalt fell between June 2018 and June 2019. So why it fell between June 2018 and 2019. So great question, and 4 marks here. We love to see it. So now, what am I looking for in this extract when I go and look for it? So of course, it's told us it's a supply and demand diagram. So I'm either looking for a supply reason that the price fell, so a shift out in supply, or a demand reason the price fell. So let's have a read through this extract. Cobalt is a key metal used in the batteries of electric cars. China is one of the largest producers of electric cars, so they use this cobalt, but has recently cut subsidies to its manufacturers. So that is probably one reason I'm going to identify. So this cut subsidies to its manufacturers, it means manufacturers will be producing less cobalt, or producing less of these electric cars, thus using less cobalt. So that, what does that mean? That means less demand for cobalt. So that's going to be one of the reasons why it shifts in. But let's keep reading. There might be another reason. So Congo produces more than 60% of the world's supply of cobalt from its small-scale mines. Many small mines have opened up, so now that's another reason. There's an increase in supply, since of course more mines means more cobalt. So of course we have, if you just quickly sketch it, we have less demand, so demand shifting in, and we have more supply, supply shifting out. thus of course will lead to a lower price. But now let's draw that a bit more accurately. So of course on your axis just is a classic supply and demand diagram. We have price on the y-axis, quantity on the x-axis. We have our original supply curve, we have our original demand curve, and if you are drawing out in the exam, of course, for the first time at least, write out supply, demand, and like I said, there is a shift outwards in supply due to new coal mines being open, so let's shift out the supply, and then there was a decrease in demand. But let's deal with supply first. So supply shifts to S+1, and then there was a decrease in demand due to China cutting a subsidy, so let's shift demand inwards now from D to D+1. Now, we've got most of the marks here, but now let's label up these new equilibriums. So what two equilibriums am I labeling up? Firstly, the original equilibrium, then we have our new equilibrium. So original equilibrium, of course, is where supply equals demand. So PE, and then just go down from there, which is QE. And now what is our new equilibrium? Is where D+1 is, so D+1 is equal to S+1. So that would be at this point here. So let's just go down from there, that will be Q1. And then we have our new price as well, which is P1. So what do we see overall? We see a reduction in price from PE to P1 and an increase in quantity demanded. And that is what would happen when we have a shift out of supply and decrease in demand, and to show what happens to the price of cobalt. But let's keep going with this question. So between June 2018 and 2019, the price of cobalt fell by, and it's one mark here. So we're talking about 2018 and 2019 June. So let's have a look at this graph we were shown earlier. So originally in June 2018, the price per pound of weight is at 40, and then in 2019 it is at 15. So working out the difference in 40 and 50. So that is of course a very simple percentage change. It's 40 take away 15 divided by 40. Why are we dividing it by 40? Of course, because 40 is the original price in 2018. Then we times that by 100, which gives us 62.5%, which is C. Therefore, that is how to get 5 out of 5 marks on question 2. And let's keep going. So it looks like we've got a bit of price discrimination here out of first impressions. But complete the third degree price discrimination diagram below. Draw the impact on each submarket by showing the price and profit. Okay, so let's see what the stimulus is saying. River Island is a clothing retailer. Students are offered a River Island student discount to benefit from a 10% price reduction as an attempt by the firm to increase profit. Now, this genuinely might be the easiest 4 marks I've ever seen on a question. All you are literally doing, they've given you the curves. All you need to do is label up the profit maximization points. And of course, this relies on you knowing where do firms profit maximize. That would be where MC equals MR. Extremely simple content knowledge. So let's go about doing this. So let's start with students. So where's MC equals MR? Remember, this is MC here and this is MR here, and it's just a straight diagonal line. So we just circle that and then we go up from there. Now we go up until, just like it's exact same theory as the normal monopoly diagram. So go up until we hit our AR curve, then we go left from there. And what will this give us? This is the profit maximization price. And then we go down from there, which would of course give us the quantity at where we profit maximize. And then this would of course, the MCAC would tell us the box of supernova profit, which therefore we would label up there as this point here would tell us the costs. We don't need to label the costs, but therefore that is the box of supernova profit. I'm just going to label that up. Box of supernova profit they make from students. So bang, and that's 2 marks done there. Let's go to the opposite side of the spectrum with non-students. Same thing. Where do we profit maximize? Where MC equals MR. So that is that point there. We'll go down firstly this time. So that would give us Q max. I'll just label that 1, Q max 1. Then keep going up from Q max 1, which will tell, then until we hit our AR curve, we go left there, which gives us P max 1. And now this again, we have our box of supernova profit, which is, this is where our costs are. So this is now our box of supernova profit. So now we'll just label this box of super normal profit for non-students. And even whilst I was recording, look how quick and easy that was. And that is a blessing of a 4-mark question. But yeah, let's keep going and let's see what the next question is. Which of the following, it's a multiple choice question, which of the following is necessary for a firm to be able to practice price discrimination? So this is essentially the question asking you, what are some of the conditions needed for a firm to price discriminate? So this question is very simple content knowledge. We want a very simple free flashcard on the UDO Econ website, but it's asking us the conditions of price discrimination. And of course, A actually labelled one of them. So one of the main conditions of price discrimination is that a firm has to have some degree of market power, but let's see some of the rest of them. They need to be able to store their product. That is not one of the necessary characteristics. the product has different features that is not another characteristic, and the costs of supplying for some customers are higher. That is again not a characteristic, so the answer therefore would be A, and that's like to get 5 out of 5 marks on question 3. And let's keep going. So straight to the question: calculate the total revenue from ticket sales from It's a Wonderful Life, assuming it is only shown 5 times at full capacity. You are advised to show your working 2-mark question. So it looks like a lot of work here for just 2 marks. Let's have a read of the stimulus. So the total cost of this production was £200,000, but remember, how do we get total revenue? The formula for total revenue is price times quantity, so we do not need to account for cost in this equation so far. So it's given us there the ticket price, so we have got the price now. Now we just need the quantity. So the theatre has a capacity of 200 seats, so this has told us, assuming it's shown 5 times at full capacity, so 300 times 5 would give us 1,500. Some good quick maths, some mental maths there. And then so that is how many tickets have been sold in total. So now I'm going to times that by 40, which should give me the total revenue. So 1,500 times 40, which is 60,000. And of course, 2 marks here, you need to give the units. I think it was in dollars, so I'm going to slap a dollar sign, a bit of a dodgy dollar sign. But yeah, so the total revenue, and to get 2 marks for this question, $60,000. And let's keep going. If I had to predict, I'm assuming it's going to get us to use the cost side of things. Another equation, I'm guessing. I haven't actually looked at it. Calculate the value of the... a bit different. So calculate the value of the government subsidy necessary for this production to cover all its costs. Okay, so we didn't finish reading the stimulus, so I'm guessing it's going to mention it there. So the company aims for revenue maximization. If that is achieved, revenue from ticket sales will cover 30% of the costs. Charitable donations contribute 12.5% to total costs. That's a good thing to know. And then a government subsidy ensures that production covers all of its costs. So the subsidy covers the rest of it. So firstly, let's work out the charitable donations. So they cover 12.5% of total costs. So of course, total costs, as it mentions here, is £200,000. So it's basically 12.5% of £200,000. How would you do that? You do 200,000 divided by 100 times 12.5, which will give us £25,000. I'm sure a lot of you could have done that in your minds. So we have £25,000 or dollars from the charitable donations. Then of course let's add in the $60,000 of revenue that we already have, so that gives us £85,000. so let's add that in. So now essentially the government would have to cover the rest, so we did $200,000, take away $85,000, which would give us $115,000, and that would be the size of the government subsidy, equals the government subsidy. And that is how to get 2 marks here. Again, very easy 2 marks. You don't even really need to be doing economics for these marks. So 100% marks that you need to make sure you're picking up. That's a really easy 4 marks. And let's keep going. Which of the following conditions is necessary for revenue maximization to occur? And now let's think about monopoly diagram. Where do firms revenue maximize? Where MR equals 0. And I bet that will be the answer in one of these. And it looks like it is. So average revenue equals average cost. No. Average revenue equals marginal cost. No, and pretty much it's D, I can see it straight away. Marginal revenue equals 0. And like I said, if you know your conditions, if you know how to manipulate your monopoly diagram, this will be a very easy and again, a very quick question. 5 marks here. You could probably, if you're really pushing yourself, get these done in around a minute. And especially with practice, definitely in around a minute. So yeah, that's how to get 5 out of 5 marks on this 4-mark question. And let's keep going. Again, another diagram. We do love a diagram. It looks like it's a perfectly competitive market here. So draw the diagrams for the equilibrium positions for both lemon market and a typical firm in the long run. So it's a long run, perfectly competitive market. And a few of you may be asking, how do I know it's perfectly competitive markets? Since that is the only diagram we basically get 2 side by side. We get market and we get a firm diagram. It's just classic representation of a perfectly competitive market. Kiara, I'm not really sure how to pronounce that name, decides to sell lemons at a local market, expecting to make normal profits. She notices that all the lemon sellers are charging the exact same price. So of course, classic features of a perfectly competitive market. And the main thing it says that draw it in the long run. And what is the main feature and the main bit of content knowledge you need to know for that? In the long run, perfectly competitive markets cannot make soon no profit, and as it says here, they will only make normal profit. So again, very easy 4 marks here. So let's get drawing. And then we have demand, and this is for market. And then what do we do from here? We get our equilibrium price of PE, and then we got equilibrium quantity QE, and then we just keep going right from our equilibrium price, which is PE. Then when we hit our firm diagram, we draw a perfectly horizontal line, and this equals D equals AR equals MR. And for those of you who have revised perfectly competitive markets, very easy, very simple stuff. Now, how do we get to show this firm is making normal profits? All we need is our AC curve needs to hit our D equals AR equals MR curve like this. So I'll try to draw it perfectly here. So yeah, something like that. So AC, and then of course, what is the last curve we're missing? MC. And why does our AC curve need to hit our MR curve perfectly? Since, of course, these firms still do profit maximize, where MC equals MR, and then this will mean, so this is a quantity where the profit maximize, and this is the price of where the profit maximize. Thus, at this price, since AC is equal to D equals AR equals MR, it means these firms are making no profit. And what is no profit? That is the same as normal profit. So the firms are not making super no profit. Essentially, if they're breaking even, we say that is normal profit. Let's finish off this question with the multiple choice and finish the section A off. Which of the following will exist in the short run if Kiara makes a loss? And it's to do with allocative and productive efficiency. A great bit of revision here. First things first, let's start with allocative efficiency. So whether it be the short run or the long run, perfectly competitive markets are always allocatively efficient. And why is that? Let's look at the curves. Whereas allocative efficiency is where MC equals AR, and when a firm profit maximizes, of course, it's where MC equals MR. So therefore, they are always going to be allocatively efficient, as where MC equals MR is the same as where MC equals AR. So now that helps us eliminate those bottom two, and now it's essentially asking us whether she's productively efficient or productively inefficient. So let's see, if Kiara was making a loss, would she be productively inefficient or efficient? So how could we show this firm making a loss? Of course, the average cost would have to be above. So we'll draw something like this. So AC1. Now let's see, is this firm productively efficient? Where is productive efficiency? Where MC equals AC. That would be this point. Therefore, they would have to produce at this quantity and at this price. Therefore, this would mean in the short run, if Kiara was making a loss, she would be allocatively efficient, but she would be productively inefficient. Thus, the answer would be B. And that's how to get 5 out of 5 marks on question 5. And more importantly, how to get 25 out of 25 on section A. Let's keep going and let's move on to section B for this 2021 paper 1. Section B, June 2021, paper 1. Let's get started straight away and start with the 5-mark question. This is an explain question. The likely impact of diminishing marginal productivity, so not utility, productivity, of labour on cabin crew staffing levels. Refer to extract A in your answer. So this question is assessing a tiny bit of the spec. It says 3.3.2 and specifically B. It says derivation of short-run cost curves from the assumption of diminishing marginal productivity. Now the reason why I'm focusing on this, in our live classes we do special classes for the A-star students, as you can literally be assessed on a tiny spec point, 3 words in a tiny spec point. So we make sure all these tiny bits of the spec, where mostly are overlooked by students, we make sure students are fully clued up on them. So it's a great example where Edexcel have assessed a tiny bit of the spec. And again, this just emphasizes my point of content mastery. You need to make sure the spec, you have it on lock, you know every single point in the spec, even these tiny little words, this tiny little bit of diminishing marginal productivity. So back onto the question, the way I would start this question to pick up the K marks is defining diminishing marginal productivity. But for those of you who do not know diminishing marginal productivity, of course, like I said, it's very similar to the concept of diminishing marginal utility. So let's use diminishing marginal utility to help find the definition for this. So a good example of diminishing marginal utility would be like something like ice creams. So for every additional unit of ice cream I consume, the additional increase in satisfaction would decline. And that is pretty much exactly the same and the exact same wording, just changing a few words around, how I would define diminishing marginal productivity, since of course it has the same words which are diminishing and marginal, and these of course mean the same thing in context. The only thing that is really changing is productivity. And how do we define productivity? Is output per unit time. So the way I would define diminishing marginal productivity is for an additional unit of labour, the additional increase in productivity declines. So essentially swapping out utility for now productivity. Okay, so like I said, for an additional unit of labour, the additional increase in productivity declines. But now that's the definition. Let's actually go about answering the question. So explaining how the impact of diminishing marginal productivity will affect the labour on cabin crew staffing levels. And let's have a quick look at extract A, because as you know, of course, this 5-mark question will have applications. So let's pick up some of these application marks. So title, marginal productivity of cabin crew. They're responsible for loading and providing in-flight meals, is planning to reduce the number of cabin crew members. But before we look at the extracts, let's use a bit of common sense. We're talking about flights and planes. And if you think about the corridor on planes or flights, it of course is quite small, it's quite limited. Thus you can understand this concept of diminishing marginal productivity, as you could have 10 flight attendants on that flight, but usually you can only fit 2 flight attendants or 2 people at the same time on that flight corridor. Therefore there's no point for more than, because on flights there's usually 2 corridors on each side, you know, like when they bring the trolley and things like that, but there's 2 workers on each corridor. Therefore there's no point of hiring any more workers than those 2, so 4 workers at a time, since they can only fit, there's a limited space, so they can only fit 4 workers on those corridors. So if you're thinking about the impact of this diminishing marginal productivity, of course the impact is going to be that flights are going to hire less workers, or just a set number of workers, as if they hire more workers, those workers cannot even, due to the limited space, cannot even be on the corridor to, like, you know, like on flights they sell like perfume and things like that, but they can't even be on the corridor since there's not enough space. Therefore, of course, it would not be worth it for these flight firms, these airline firms, to hire them. But let's have a look. Let's have a look at the extract. That's just my own personal thought, and let's see what the extract is saying. So, marginal productivity of the cabin crew is the title. It talks about the responsibilities of the cabin crew. United Airlines are looking to reduce the number of cabin crew. So again, that aligns with what I was thinking. So one effect is definitely going to be of the diminishing marginal productivity is that flight airlines firms are going to look to reduce the number of cabin crew. So United Airlines operates with 1 more cabin crew member, and that cabin crew member's marginal productivity is low, and therefore it means it is quite inefficient. So my assumption holds correct. And of course, just to finish that off, I've explained the impact of this diminishing marginal productivity. So the impact, of course, like the extract basically told us, is a reduction in staffing levels. Then just try to pick up a few application marks. And why is that? Again, just using some common sense. On flight corridors, of course, there's limited space for the trolley, for basically like the things they sell. And in the extract, they talk about in-flight meals, and of course, they're pretty much bringing that on the trolley as well. So I thought to include that. And then just a bit of analysis, a bit of like explanation of what I mean by that, as by hiring more workers, it's essentially what you learn in like specialisation, division of labour, but by hiring more workers, due to the limited space, the additional output per unit of labour declines. As of course, by having 2 workers on that flight corridor, they can pretty much do the job. You know, the 3rd worker can probably support those 2 workers, but the additional output of him is going to decline compared to the first 2 workers. But yeah, that is how I would answer that 5-mark question. Definitely a slightly unique 5-mark question compared to other 5-mark questions, but again, that means it's a really good one to practice, since of course unique questions, if you're prepared for the unique questions, most individuals will drop marks on these, and if you can make sure you're securing the marks in the unique questions, it means that, again, that's how grade boundaries work. If you're scoring marks where individuals are dropping marks, that is the route for the A-star. Moving on to the next question, which is of course is the 8-mark question. Examine the likely impact of Thomas Cook's plan to reduce the airline emissions. Extract B, line 6. On the socially optimum position, use an appropriate externalities diagram in your answer. So that looks like a really good question. Let's dissect this. So firstly, it's talking about an externalities diagram. In Edexcel, you learn 2 main ones, which is negative production and positive consumption. We're talking about emissions, so of course, airline emissions, that is of course going to be a negative externality. So let's start drawing this, but let's have a deeper read into the question and the extract. So the impact of Thomas Cook's plan to reduce the airline emission. So they're fighting against it, okay, and its impact on the socially optimum position. Let's have a quick read of extract B and see if it hints at anything else. So extract B looks quite short here. So Thomas Cook's environmental impact. Okay, so they have essentially have lots of shops. The environmental impact of the travel industry is significant. It counts for 8%. That looks like a good stat to use of all of global carbon emissions. So they're actively trying to reduce their airline emissions. They're trying to use a more efficient and lower carbon fuel aircraft. And they were included in the world's top 10 most fuel efficient airlines. Okay, now yesterday actually, I recorded a video called How to Get an A-star going into year 13. It's probably a couple of months ago now from when you're watching this video, maybe a couple of years ago now from when you're watching this video. But one of the main things I was emphasizing in that video is now when you're going into year 13, what you want to do is not just be able to recall diagrams, but actually understanding the diagrams, understanding what the curves mean, being able to manipulate the curves. And this question is a prime example of why you need a depth of understanding about diagrams and not just being able to recall the simple curves, as this question is assessing you on your ability to manipulate this negative externalities diagram, not just knowing your negative externalities diagram. So let's get started with the diagram itself. So of course, negative externality diagram is cost/benefits on your y-axis, quantity on your x-axis. But why is this negative externalities? Again, since if you think about airlines, planes, why do they cause negative externalities? And the main thing is it's embedded in the theory. This is because the social cost, the marginal social cost to society is higher than the marginal private cost. And why is that? Since the private cost of running an airline is just the cost to the firm. For example, it's the cost of the pilot, it's the cost of charting the plane, it's the cost of the fuel. Whereas the cost to society of the airline is things like climate change, is things like of air pollution. So all these negative effects on society, and we say the negative effects on society are much larger than the cost to the airline firm itself. Therefore, that discrepancy is the external cost and what we call negative externalities. So let's show that on the diagram. So of course, we get started, wrong pattern. So we get started with our marginal private cost. So we say supply equals marginal private cost. Then we say demand equals marginal private benefit equals marginal social benefit. And then of course, since it's negative externalities, like we said, there's a discrepancy between private costs and social cost. So this is marginal social cost. And like I said, due to airlines causing negative externalities, that means that social cost is higher than marginal private cost. And remember, what is the difference between these two curves? And if your content knowledge is strong, you should be able to recall this. That is, of course, external costs. But now let's finish labeling this diagram up. And what do we need to finish labeling up? Of course, the welfare loss. How do we get the welfare loss? The thing I teach my students, it may not make much sense initially. You go from your market equilibrium, and your market equilibrium is, of course, where supply equals demand. And then you go up or down following the social curve. And in this scenario, the social curve is above, so we go from the market equilibrium up, and that would now give us our welfare loss. And that is a way to never get it wrong if you can understand what that means. So now this is our triangle of welfare loss, and let's just label up the quantities. So what will this quantity represent? Of course, where the marginal social cost intersects the marginal social benefit. Therefore, this quantity here would be the socially efficient equilibrium. So I'm going to label this QSE, and then this point here, the market equilibrium, would be QE. But now, the question is telling us Thomas Cook's plan is to reduce the airline emissions. Now, if Thomas Cook are reducing the airline emissions, what does this mean? It means, essentially, very simply, there's less negative effects on society. For example, there's less climate change, there's less air pollution. How is that going to affect our diagram now? We said the difference in marginal private cost and marginal social cost is the external cost, the cost to society. And of course, if the airline emissions are reducing, it means the external cost is also reducing. So how would we show that on this diagram? Of course, that would therefore mean if the cost to society is essentially decreasing, the MSC curve would shift inwards or would shift towards the right. And that is pretty much the main thing that we need to show on this diagram. So all I'm going to do is shift the MSC curve slightly to the right, label it MSC1, and that is exactly how you would show Thomas Cook reducing the airline emissions on this diagram. And as long as you have a decent depth of understanding of this diagram, this is a golden and a really easy 8-mark question, since all it is pretty much assessing you on is knowing the difference between MSC and MPC is external cost, and just knowing how to shift your MSC curve. So how we're going to finish this off, I'm just going to finish this off by labelling up my new MSC1 curve with the new welfare loss, of course, the new reduced welfare loss, and the new points, so the socially efficient equilibrium quantity and the market equilibrium quantity. So as expected, as the external cost is reducing, so is the welfare loss triangle. So therefore, our new welfare loss triangle, I'm going to label this welfare loss 1, and of course, new socially efficient equilibrium, which should be at this point here. Again, now we're MSC1 equals MSB, and it would just be this point here. And yeah, that is quite simply how to do this diagram. So let's pick up the last few marks by adding the application and putting a bit of this into wording. So I just want to find a bit of application where they're talking about reducing their emissions. Yep, so they've actively, so that's a good one I can use, they've actively engaged in reducing their carbon emissions. Yeah, so any one of them. So they have lower carbon fuel, the top 10 most efficient fuel, top 10 world's most efficient fuel engines, so probably will use that. So all I'm going to say here, if they're planning to reduce airline emissions, if the engines are the top 10 most fuel efficient engines, it's going to, of course, mean, like I just told you guys, the cost to society, the marginal social cost is going to decrease. This decreases the discrepancy between MSC and MPC, which is the external cost. Those external costs decrease, and external cost decrease, this causes MSC to shift inwards, to shift towards the right, to a new curve, which is MSC1. And then, of course, you can talk about how the welfare loss decreases, the socially efficient equilibrium moves to right as well. That's pretty much everything all right there. So I've just added the how MSC shifts, how there's a small triangle welfare loss, and since the question, of course, was specifically referring to the socially optimum point, I've added a reference there. The thing is, I have actually only got one bit of application here. This second part wouldn't actually be classed as application, I believe, since it is mentioned in the question. And if you remember back to the structure of 8-mark questions, 2 for each KA, so 2 knowledge, 2 application, 2 analysis. So I'm just going to grab one more point from the application to make sure I'm securing those 2 application marks. And now, of course, there are still 2 marks left for evaluation. I think a really easy way to evaluate this, classic way to evaluate an externality diagram, it depends on the degree to which Thomas Cook reduced their airline emissions. Since we've just assumed they're pretty much going to shift the MSC to here, but in reality, they might literally just shift it to there, right next to the MSC, right next to the original MSC curve, thus meaning it kind of negates a lot of the positive effects we spoke about. It means the socially efficient equilibrium only slightly shifts, we only have a slight reduction in welfare loss, thus a lot of these positive effects we spoke about will be negated and will not be felt by society. And of course, even in the extract, and always trying to use evaluation from the extract is a lot more specific. It talks about how Thomas Cook has 560 high street agents. It provides not only flights, hotels and package holidays. All these will also contribute to carbon emissions. So you could talk about how they're only reducing carbon emissions on their planes, on their airlines, rather than holistically removing it. Like, for example, the high street agents or the hotels may be pumping out lots of carbon emissions as well. So you can talk about how they're negating one side and just focusing on one aspect, which is flight. But yeah, that's how I would answer this 8-mark question for 8 marks. And let's move on to the 10-mark question. Moving swiftly on to the next question, which of course is a 10-mark question. With reference to extract C, assess whether Thomas Cook's failure was caused by the principal agent problem. Now that is a good bit of content revision there. So what is the principal agent problem? So the principal are the owners of the firm. For example, the shareholders. Then the agents are the individuals who usually run the business on a day-to-day basis. For example, CEOs, and more importantly, managers. Now, we usually say there's a discrepancy between objectives between the principal and the agent. So the principal, the shareholders, usually want to pursue profit maximization. But then the managers, like I said, there's a discrepancy. The managers usually want to pursue things like objectives like sales maximization, revenue maximization. And why is that? Since managers' bonuses are usually tied to the amount of sales they make, therefore they have a massive incentive to push sales rather than pushing objectives like profit maximization. But what is the problem with this? The problem is that since the agents are running the business on a day-to-day basis, there's asymmetric information. So agents can essentially just pursue sales maximization, maximize their bonuses, and the principal, these shareholders, cannot do anything about it, or they don't even know about it. And that is a principal agent problem. It's asymmetric information between the principal and the agent leads to a discrepancy between the objectives being pursued. And to put it in technical terms, the divorce of ownership and control can lead to the principal agent problem, as it looks like this is happening here in Thomas Cook's example. But let's have a look at extract C to see whether the principal agent problem is actually the cause of the failure. So pretty much in this entire extract, quite a long extract, I'm just looking for any examples of principles, so like the shareholders talking about profit maximization, or the managers talking about, or the CEOs talking about sales maximization or like bonuses. So let's have a scan through this and see if we can find anything. So here it talks about a merger. It merged with My Travel in 2017, and the directors had a objective of rapid company growth over short-term profitability. And we could use this in the principal agent problem argument, as directors, of course, would be agents. Therefore, they may have been pursuing growth for things like bonuses instead of the actual objective that the shareholders wanted, which was short-term profitability. So this paragraph looks quite good. The role of management in Thomas Cook's collapse is being investigated. Thomas Cook's executive salaries and bonuses, massive keyword here, which you can use, have been questions. Directors have salaries totaling 20 million in 5 years before its collapse. The CEO owned a £500,000 cash bonus. That is a perfect example of maybe he was pursuing alternative objectives. Maybe he was pursuing sales maximization to maximize his bonus rather than chasing the objective of the principal. And about 8.5 million in his 5 years of the company. And then the last paragraph essentially just talks about the moral hazard of bailing out Thomas Cook and the reasons why the government did not do it. So there's not much here besides basically the government talking about a moral hazard. But I've left this little bit out just to emphasize and just to help further my point of emphasis on why past papers are a golden resource. So you don't really talk too much, you don't really use principal agent problem too much. It's quite a small part of the spec. But there's a really good in real life solution, or for us it works as an evaluation point to the principal agent problem. And what is that? Let's have a look at this last few lines of this paragraph. This last few lines of this paragraph mentions how the CEO's salary was 8.5 million, but then it also talks about how 4 million of that 8.5 million salary was in the form of shares. Now, why is that so important? Since the main point with the principal agent problem is that managers, CEOs' bonuses are linked to sales. Therefore, they have an incentive to sales maximize. And you can see that here. He was paid a £500,000 bonus. So we would assume, and via the principal agent problem, we would assume that the CEO has an incentive to sales maximize and go against the principal's objective of profit maximizing. But now, if you look at this, he has 4 million worth of shares, which of course means the CEO is a shareholder. And what do shareholders want to do? They want to profit maximize, to maximize their share value. This means this will help negate the principal agent problem. Why? Since yes, we say the CEOs could have a sales maximization incentive, as they have the bonuses are linked to sales. But in reality, also the CEO has a massive incentive to profit maximize. Why? Because the CEO, yes, he's an agent, he runs a business day to day, but also he is a shareholder, and shareholders want to profit maximize. So we say this helps negate the principal agent problem. And the reason why I'm talking about this is, of course, it is a very good evaluation point, and probably the best evaluation point you can write for principal agent problem. The only problem is it doesn't come up. Principal agent problem isn't assessed much, so it's not really, you can't use it a lot. But when it is assessed, 10 out of 10 A-star evaluation point. And of course, you could use this to comment on, of course, the CEO did not do this on purpose. He had 4 million worth of shares, which he lost as well. So he lost, since he was a shareholder, he lost a lot of capital as well. Okay, so the way I would answer this question, firstly, let's talk about, so when companies get larger, I would start with just briefly mentioning the divorce of ownership and control. I'll then just talk about how this leads to the principal agent problem. Of course, we did mention principal agent problem. We did mention exactly what the principal agent problem is, but I'll just make sure to use that bit of application we picked up here. So the CEO and the £500,000 cash bonus, and talk about how due to the asymmetric information between the principal and the agents, of course the CEO being an agent, the CEO is likely to pursue something like sales maximization instead of pursuing an objective like that the principals want them to pursue, like profit maximization, as of course the CEO has an incentive due to their bonuses are usually linked to sales. If you have time and if you can, 100%, I would throw in a nice little monopoly diagram. Just talk. You could throw in the point of sales maximization. You could throw in the point of profit maximization, and just contrast them. Say when you talk about the agent, you could say, for example, the CEO would be pursuing at the sales maximization point, which of course is where AC equals AR, whereas the principal, the shareholders want the firm to pursue profit maximization, which of course would be where MC equals MR. So for example, the firm is charging P-sale to maximize the managers, the CEO's bonuses, rather than what the shareholders want, which is profit maximization. So they're charging P-sale instead of charging P-max. The second thing you can link this to in the extract is the merger. Of course, what does the merger do? It increases market share, and again, that links to these CEOs, these agents' bonuses. As for example, if the firm is controlling more market share, it can sell to more, as more customers to sell to. Therefore, it furthers the objective of sales maximizing, thus increasing their bonuses. So therefore, you could also mention that the merger with this MyTravel was probably due to it wasn't actually in the it wasn't in the best interest of the principals, so the shareholders. It was more in the best interest of the agents who are pursuing their objectives of sales maximizing. Of course, with regards to the 10-mark question, that will be around 2 marks for application. So make sure you're quoting these figures. You're using the extract for application as much as possible. When you talk about the merger, you can talk about how they talk about rapid company growth. So like trying to maximize the market share instead of the profitability, which principals would be wanting to pursue. But then, of course, there's 6 marks for KA and then 4 marks for evaluation. How would you evaluate this? Like I said, we went through that evaluation point earlier. So essentially, a solution, a way to evaluate the principal agent problem is that the CEOs actually had shares. Therefore, they were shareholders alongside being agents. So they were principals alongside being agents. thus it reduces the degree to which there would be that principal agent problem. So therefore you could say there was no incentive for the CEO to pursue sales maximization, as he was now a shareholder, thus he also had the incentive to be profit maximizing. And that pretty much negates the entire principal agent problem, as it negates the assumption that the CEO was trying to sales maximize. As if you just think about it relatively as well, he earned a £500,000 cash bonus, but his shares were 4 million. So why would he risk his 4 million worth of shares for a £500,000 bonus? It's almost 8 times the amount of shares he had to his bonus. So of course it does not make sense. Another great valuation point with this, there is no mention to the agents being monitored or like audits, anything like that. And of course, that is a very effective method that shareholders can use to make sure that the principal agent problem does not exist. As if the agents are being monitored, if the day-to-day activity is being, like I said, monitored and audited, it makes it extremely hard for these agents to pursue different objectives than the principals want. So there's not much mention here to the shareholders. So you could put a degree of blame on the shareholders that they didn't really follow up with the agents. They didn't really do any sort of meetings monitoring these agents. And of course, by monitoring these agents, it would reduce that degree of asymmetric information, thus reduce a principal agent problem. So yeah, that's another great valuation point. And that is pretty much all I would write for that 10-mark question. Let's keep going and let's get started with the 12-mark question. With reference to extract C, discuss the proposed government subsidy to prevent Thomas Cook from reaching its shutdown point. So this is definitely a quite unique question and a bit more difficult than the rest of this section C. So let's have a quick look over extract C, where it mentions the government subsidy and the shutdown point. So having another look over that last paragraph where it mentions the subsidy, the UK Prime Minister admitted the government refused to grant a 150 million, so that's a great bit of application, as a subsidy to rescue Thomas Cook in the short run. Now that is a great point. So they needed to rescue Thomas Cook in the short run. So, and since this is talking about the shutdown point, we're specifically now referring to the short run shutdown point, which of course is slightly different to the long run shutdown point. And of course in the extract, the moral hazard point would work as a great evaluation. There are obviously a few more things in this extract, such as of course the big thing. In May 2019, a firm reported a 1.5 billion loss, and we are only talking about a 150 million subsidy in the short run, so it's not even 10%, well, around 10%. Okay, let's get started. So from the extract, we picked up that Thomas Cook could be operating below a short-run shutdown point. And what is the condition for being below your short-run shutdown point? That is, of course, when your average variable costs are greater than your price. Now, why is it so dangerous if average variable cost is greater than price? And why do firms shut down if they reach this condition? That is as, if a firm is not covering their average variable costs, it means every single unit they sell, they are making a loss. Therefore, to cut their losses, they should shut down as soon as possible. As the longer they stay in the market, the more units they sell, the worse this loss becomes. And of course, AVC and our shutdown points, we can show this on the diagram. Therefore, like I say, it pays dividends to have that content mastery. So let's show this on a diagram. So of course, it is just a simple cost/revenue diagram, quantity on the axes. Now what are we showing here? So we're not just going to show our average costs here. We're going to show the two other curves. We're going to show average total costs and average variable costs. And how are we going to do this? So if a firm is at a short run shutdown point, we need to make sure our average variable cost curve is higher than our price. So where we do this, so this is going to be our D equals AR, not it is our MR curve. Then the way I'm going to draw it, I'm going to draw AVC, I'm going to draw ATC first, something like that, ATC, then I'm going to draw AVC, oop, that's a pretty bad one, so then AVC, and therefore, as you can see, they're both above my D equals AR curve, thus this would mean where the firm is going to be making a loss. Then let's finish off with the MC, and now let's show where this firm profit maximizes. Of course, a firm profit maximizes where MC equals MR, which is this point here, then you go up from there until you hit your AR curve, go left from there. This would now give us a profit maximization price, but now let's see the losses this firm is making. So now we keep going up until here. This tells us, what does this box tell us? This essentially tells us the average variable cost is greater than price, so the firm should shut down. It's gone past, it's met the condition of the short run shutdown point, which is this. But then what does this show us? This of course shows us including our fixed costs. So now, of course, we need to put this into words and actually explain to the examiner what is happening for this 12-mark question. So firstly, of course, I would start off by defining a subsidy. Of course, a subsidy lowers producers' cost of production. It's a grant by the government. And what will it do? And the scenario I would present here, so of course, we have our diagram. The short-run shutdown point is drawn. The scenario I would present is that if the government subsidised, like it says in the extract, they discussed a £150 million subsidy. If the government gives Thomas Cook this £150 million subsidy, it could lower AVC to the point somewhere like here, where now average variable cost is below price, which means now we are below our short run shutdown point condition, thus meaning that the firm can continue to operate in the short run and then use that to help reduce costs and move forward in the long run. And in past years, I've had lots of students say this question is quite tricky, but from here, I would go on to say how if Thomas Cook can survive in the long run, they could restructure and they could use that. They could use that, for example, as it says in the extract. They are mainly an in-person company, and they were trying to fight off the emerging internet rivals. But they could use this time. They now how they're still in the market in the short run. They could use this to restructure, become more of an internet-based company. And of course, really here, I'm trying to dig out in the extract. This paragraph actually is a gem where it mentions some of the reasons why it failed. One of the big reasons is Brexit uncertainty, which you can mention, which of course was happening in 2019. And you could mention that if they're able to survive in the short run, of course, Brexit uncertainty could have reduced consumer confidence. And going on holiday, some would say, is a luxury good. Therefore, they reduce their demand for luxury goods. So essentially what I'm saying, if Thomas Cook could have survived in the long run, once this Brexit uncertainty has now gone away, they could therefore in the long run become profitable again and paid off their debt, moved above their short run shutdown point. So that's also a massive point you can mention there. And I'm sure as you can tell, this is definitely a more difficult chain of analysis. You just have to try to exhaust the extract as much as possible, describe subsidies as much as possible, use this diagram as much as possible, quote the points, pick up those application marks, and of course, use your extract, make sure you're using the figures, talk about the debt, talk about even, of course, this little bit at the top as well. So with Thomas Cook failing, the government didn't subsidise them, and at the end of the day, they had to help these 600,000 travellers. They had to pay benefits to the 21,000 employees who were left without a job. That's also another thing you could mention. So whenever you're stuck on your chain of analysis, the answers are in the extract. You just have to go about finding them. And yes, I do understand this 12 marker is a bit difficult, but it's a really good practice. So moving on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph, a slight thing people forget with 12 mark questions, it still is only 4 valuation marks here. Yes, that's a decent amount, but 2 valuation points, 2 especially developed evaluation points, is more than enough. And the first evaluation point I am 100% going to speak about is just the proportion. So the proportion of debt, the proportion of losses, 1.5 billion in losses compared to the 150 million subsidy. And the way you can word this evaluation point, saying however in evaluation, this depends on whether the size of the government subsidy is large enough to reduce Thomas Cook's average variable costs. As we know, compared to the loss, it's only 10% compared to the loss. Therefore, they may give them the subsidy and it still may not reduce average variable cost below the price. Therefore, it may be somewhere like here, thus meaning Thomas Cook are still forced to close down. And of course, that will be a massive example of government failure where they subsidise, they don't subsidise the right amount, and basically they're just throwing money away. So essentially, it depends on the size of the government subsidy or whether it actually ends up being significant. Of course, a classic one always subsidies is opportunity cost. Not going to go too much into depth with that. Another great one they did mention here is the moral hazard. The massive moral hazard this sets up if the government subsidises Thomas Cook. As what happened in 2008, when the banking sector failed, they called them too big to fail. Why is that? As when they failed, the government bailed them out, and that creates a massive moral hazard. And what does it mean for a moral hazard? There was no consequence on the banking sector for failing. Since, yeah, they failed, they made the wrong decisions, they took too much risk, but what happened in the end? The government just came and saved them. And if the government came and saved Thomas Cook, that will lead to probably future companies trying the same thing where they take too many risks, they end up failing, and the government would have to bail them out, and it sets a really poor precedent. Therefore, you could say in the long run, due to the moral hazard, it could lead to massive strains on the government budget, as they would have to be bailing out lots of companies, massive economic uncertainty, as lots of firms would take massive risk, maybe lots of debt-fueled risk, and therefore, with them all expecting the government to bail them out, if they don't, it could lead to massive recessionary pressures. Now, another great evaluation point stems from a very popular economics book, which is The Power of Creative Destruction. Now, I'm sure a few of you have heard of creative destruction, but the book basically mentions that zombie firms, which Thomas Cook in this example would be a zombie firm, they should be allowed to go bust. And therefore, it allows more efficient companies, more efficient firms to use the resources that they've left. Essentially, Thomas Cook has forced itself out of the market, making massive losses, not efficient enough. Therefore, instead of the government trying to bail them out, they should just let the free market do its job. And another firm will come, another profit maximising firm will come into the market, will solve the gap, and will be able to use those resources that Thomas Cook had more efficiently. And that concept of zombie firms is actually mentioned by the examiners. It's a really good one to do a bit of research on. But yeah, that's more than enough evaluation for this paragraph. And like I said, most students that do this question do struggle with it a bit, so do not worry if it's a bit of a difficult question. Just try to use it as a revision, especially if you maybe weren't clued up on this diagram. Make sure you revise it, as remember, any part of the spec can be assessed. Let's get started with the last question in this section B, which is the 15-mark question. With reference to the information provided, discuss the decision by Jet2 to increase the price of its package holiday prices. So we haven't read anything in the extract about Jet2 so far, but if you know any knowledge about the UK airlines industry, you'll know that Thomas Cook and Jet2 were both airline providers, and they were both competitors. Therefore, let's think about this scenario. So as we know, Thomas Cook has left the market, and now Jet2 is left. And now Jet2 have decided, as a competitor has left the market, they've decided to increase the price of their holidays. And the things I'm thinking about here, they are definitely substitute goods. As with Thomas Cook leaving the market, there's now almost a scarcity. There's a massive decrease in supply for these holidays. So Jet2 are trying to capitalise on that scarcity, that decrease in supply, by increasing the prices of their own holidays. So let's have a read of the extract, because I'm sure it will mention Jet2 somewhere. So we've got to read through these extracts. Okay, so figure 2, what does figure 1 show? So we'll start with figure 1. So the travel and tourism industry package holiday market share by the 6 largest providers booked by UK residents. So we have Jet2 and Thomas Cook. So yeah, Thomas Cook has a 13% market share, Jet2 just above it with a 16% market share, TUI with a nearly 30% market share there. So yeah, it does make sense. And then if we look at this second, so Jet2 holiday prices, they increase from £7.88 per person to now £8.24 per person, so about a £40 increase, well, 30 something pound increase before and after the shutdown of Thomas Cook. Let's directly answer the question, why has Jet2 decided to increase the price of the package holidays? Of course, it all goes back to the classical economic assumption. The main reason is for profits. They want to maximise profits, increase profits as much as possible. So that is going to be, I'm going to do this in 2 separate paragraphs, but that is going to be the overarching theme for both these paragraphs. Okay, so now let's go to explain how, by increasing the price of the package holidays, Jet2's profits, so their revenues first, then their profits, then tend to increase. So the first thing first, I'm going to look at this, and I'm going to use this figure again. So of course, again, Thomas Cook had 13% market share, Jet2 had a respective 16% market share. Thomas Cook was the 3rd biggest firm in this package holiday industry. Thus, when Thomas Cook collapsed, how does this affect the supply in the market? Of course, and we can show that on a little supply and demand diagram, price on your y-axis, quantity on your x-axis. And of course, when Thomas Cook collapses, supply shifts inwards from S+1. Now, let's have a look at the quantity. So quantity, of course, as we can expect, it decreased from QE to Q1. But more importantly, let's see what happens to prices. Prices increase from PE to now P1. And to add those application marks, a really good thing you do in micro, instead of just putting price and quantity, we can now put quantity of package holidays and price of package holidays, or you can put supply of package holidays, demand of package holidays. You get what I mean? And these small little things sometimes do help you pick up a few application marks. But of course, if you think about it really simply, the supply in the market of package holidays has decreased. So what does it actually mean for the incumbent firm of Jet2? It means that Jet2 is now, there's less firms competing in the market, thus Jet2 faces less competition in the market, which allows, due to less competition in the market, there's less firms to steal their demand. It means that Jet2 is now able to increase prices from PE to P1, which you can see, and we can quote this, where Jet2 increased prices from 7.88 to 8.24, 12 hours after the shutdown of one of its biggest competitors. And if you want to extend this chain of analysis slightly longer, a great link here is to do with the time frame. So you can mention the time frame, and specifically, and this is the question, the context is definitely hinting at it, specifically with giving you this bit of information, the price 12 hours after. And of course, 12 hours after is definitely, and it's hinting towards the short run. And let's think about this, let's present this scenario. You had a holiday booked with Thomas Cook, and that got cancelled. Like maybe you're at the airport and that got cancelled. Now, you still really want to go on holiday, and there's very few other substitutes with this much market share. So of course there's TUI, but there's not many other substitutes. Therefore, if Jet2 increases its prices, due to the degree of inelastic demand, in the market, consumers are not very, and how do you define inelastic demand? Then consumers are not very responsive to change your price. Therefore, as they still want to go on holiday, they don't want to go home from the airport. They would much rather just pay a slightly higher price than they paid with Thomas Cook, as it means they can still go on holiday. But what does that show? It means in the short term at least, there's a massive degree of inelastic demand, thus meaning Jet2 can use this degree of inelastic demand and of course maximize its profits via it. So in the short run, Jet2's revenue and also its profits increase. Okay, so just briefly written that out, Thomas Cook had a 13% market share. When they shut down, of course, supply shifts inwards from S to S+1. This causes less competition in the market, thus Jet2 can now increase their prices from PE to P1. In the short run, consumers' demand also is inelastic. Why is that? There's few substitutes, and consumers, most importantly, they still want to go on holiday. Therefore, consumers, and what does that mean? If the demand is inelastic, it means consumers are not very responsive to changes in prices, thus which is perfect for Jet2, of course, as it means Jet2 can, and they've identified that after Thomas Cook was shut down, there is going to be inelastic demand. There's going to be a degree of inelastic demand, thus meaning they can increase prices and not have a massive decrease in demand, thus meaning increasing revenues, increasing profits. It's a very clever and a very effective strategy, and very well implemented in time, very timely mannerly implemented for Jet2 to experience an increase in their profit. Let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. Now, for this question, I really do feel like it's one of the easiest questions to evaluate, since there are so many points here to evaluate. But let's cover some of the main ones. So, however, in evaluation, my first point would be, the word is however in evaluation. This depends on how other firms respond to Thomas Cook leaving the market. As for example, there are like we can see on this diagram, there's TUI, there's Expedia. But most importantly, I'm going to say, as remember, Thomas Cook has now left. So this market share essentially needs to be reallocated. And of course, every firm wants to gain this market share. So a firm like TUI, seeing that Thomas Cook's market share, they've left, and now Thomas Cook's market share needs to be reallocated. What they may try to do, instead of increasing prices to incentivize consumers to now buy their product, they may pursue something like sales maximization. And of course, how can we show that on a diagram? We show that on a cost revenue diagram. So MCMRD equals AR. At what point on a cost revenue diagram can we see sales maximization? That would of course be where AC equals AR, where a firm maximizes sales to make without making a loss. Therefore, that would put them in the prime and the best position for them to gain that market share that Thomas Cook has lost, for them to steal those consumers away. And especially for Jet2, it will mean their decision to increase prices will actually cause a decrease in their revenues and a decrease in their profits, since it depends, like I said, the evaluation point, it depends on how the other firms respond. And for example, if they respond with strategies like sales max or like predatory pricing, it will lead to Jet2's plan almost failing, and instead of gaining more profits, it will actually lead to a reduction in profit. So this is how I briefly word it. If I was writing it as a full evaluation point, I would of course mention quite a few of the points I mentioned earlier verbally. But however, in evaluation, depends on how other firms respond. E.G. And I'd 100% use TUI, as then you can include the you can include the application. I think it said 31% market share. So, for example, TUI may sales maximize to gain that market share that Thomas Cook lost, so they benefit from the reallocation of the market share, thus undercutting Jet2. And yeah, of course, if the sales maximize, they will undercut Jet2, since Jet2 has chosen to increase its prices, thus meaning Jet2 loses its price sensitive customers, and of course at the end of the day, less profits, less revenue. Now moving on to the second evaluation point, you do use this point in macro, but this is we're talking about a completely different point here. The wording is just the same, and it's all to do with consumers' confidence. Let's think about it. Let's put you in the scenario of you're about to go on holiday and you've booked with a really trusted firm, but your holiday, and they just randomly go bankrupt, and your holiday has just now been cancelled. Are you likely to respond to that with still really wanting to go on holiday? Since remember, holidays usually just normally have quite a lot of uncertainty. People are quite scared to go on planes, go abroad. So therefore, originally there's lots of uncertainty. Then your holiday randomly gets cancelled. Are you going to now go out your way to try and book another holiday? Probably not. So now, it depends. I would say, however, in evaluation, so the word is evaluation point, saying, however, in evaluation, This depends on the level of consumer confidence, as consumers may lose confidence in the airline industry, thus decrease their demand or just stop demanding holidays, thus meaning, of course, and the main thing, Jet2's response by an increase in prices will actually be quite negative and will cause a further reduction in their demand. Another way you could say that, if you haven't talked about TUI yet, is of course Jet2 and Thomas Cook had very similar market shares, and of course Thomas Cook went bust. So you could say consumers may want to, instead of buying from these smaller firms, they want to buy from a more established firm like TUI, which has 29% market share, so it has almost double the market share that Jet2 and Thomas Cook respectively had. So if we could say consumers, instead of buying from Jet2, they buy from the more established, the larger market share firm, which of course again could reduce the demand for Jet2. Now lastly, it would not be a question about prices if we didn't mention regulation. So of course you can talk about having a valuation. This depends on the degree of CMA regulation. As a CMA may step in, may see that as they understand consumers are to a degree now vulnerable, and Jet2 can use this established position to exploit consumers, thus leading to higher prices, higher profits for Jet2. So it depends on the degree of CMA regulation. The CMA may step in and stop Jet2 increasing their prices, which of course always works as a really good evaluation point. And of course you do not need to write every single one of these to pick up the evaluation marks, but it's a really good practice of evaluation to try to test yourself, to try to see how much evaluation and how in-depth evaluation you can think of in an exam scenario. Okay, so with regards to the second paragraph, again, the decision by Jet2 to increase the price of its package holiday will again further increase their profits. But what am I going to say for the reasoning for that? So what I'm going to mention is that, remember, these two are both very similar firms in the package holiday market industry. Therefore, you can talk about their XCD values, so how close of substitutes they are. And if we go on to assume that, and it'd be a valid assumption, I believe, that they are a close substitute, and close substitutes, remember, the PD value is going to be greater than 1. This will mean when Thomas Cook exited the market, how is the demand, as remember, we're assuming that they are close substitutes, how is the demand for Jet2 going to be affected? And of course we can show that on a cost revenue diagram. If we just quickly sketch this out, AC, MC, MR, AR. So of course, how do you show an increase in demand on this cost revenue diagram? Of course, what we would show is both your D equals AR curve shifting out and your MR curve shifting out, something like this. So D equals AR1 and MR1. And of course, what effect will this have on this diagram? It will in fact lead to an increase in supernal profits for the firm, which of course is the overarching reason why Jet2 chose to increase their prices. And just to show that in a bit more of a civilized manner, you can show this like this. So of course, just your D equals AR and your MR shift out to D equals AR. So D1 equals AR1 and MR shifts to MR1. And of course, we get this new box, larger box of supernal profits, which is the red box, instead of the original smaller box of supernal profit. And yeah, of course, make sure to label up the prices. So we have Pmax1 instead of originally having just Pmax, and then of course quantities, which is Qmax instead of, well, now we have Qmax. But yeah, quite a simple and a brief paragraph, but just make sure if you include your diagram, try and include it as much as possible. It will help you pick up quite a lot of marks there. But with regards to evaluation, again, you've evaluated a lot in the first paragraph. You can, if you didn't use some of those points from the last paragraph, you can use them here. But the easiest one to evaluate is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the closeness of these two firms as substitutes. So it essentially depends on the XCD of substitutes, as they may not actually be close substitutes, thus meaning when Thomas Cook shuts down, the demand may not be reallocated towards Jet2, thus meaning, of course, it limits the degree to which Jet2's demand shifts out, the MR shifts out, thus meaning they do not actually get to experience a massive or a significant increase in supernormal profit. Also, another great evaluation point you could mention is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame. As in the short run, 100%, it is possible that lots of Thomas Cook's demand could be reallocated towards Jet2. However, in the long run, consumers have more time. They're more likely to seek alternatives, seek better solutions like maybe online providers, maybe TUI. Thus, it could limit the degree to which Jet2's demand sustainably shifts out and increases. So lots of evaluation points and lots of points there. I think it's a great 50 marker to test your knowledge. It's lots of like application, using your own brain. It's Of course, it's embedded in economics, but Edexcel really tests you with using your own knowledge, trying to use your own decision making, your own critical thinking to try and answer these questions. But yeah, that is how I'd answer this 15-mark question to get 15 out of 15, and that is it for section B in this 2021 paper 1. Section C 2021, let's get right on with question number 7, the first 25-mark question. So, evaluate the disadvantages of a significant increase in the national living wage on a specific labour market, such as that for social care workers. Now, straight away, this reminds me of exactly what the Edexcel examiners said in 2019, and I'll quote it perfectly. So, in the summary of the paper in 2019, they said, spend time studying current developments in economics that are relevant to your specification. And this, again, I emphasise it a lot, but in 25-mark questions, you need that depth of application. You need to understand the real world of economics. To get the A's and the A stars, you cannot get away with just theory. You need a depth of knowledge in the real world application side. So you need to be able to link that theory, that theoretical understanding, to real world examples. There's quite a chunky stimulus it's given us here. Let's have a read of it. The national living wage, the minimum wage for 25-year-olds and over, is expected to rise to no more than £10.50 an hour in 2024 compared to £8.72 in 2020. This does not apply to self-employed or gig economy workers. Now that is a good mention there. Of course, it's not explicitly on the spec, but again, in the live classes, we do teach the gig economy since it has such a relevant link, especially with the real world of economics, to labour market. Some economists said that the increase was ambitious. The business groups warned that employers in sections such as social care, again, this is a great example, one that actually last year we taught in the live classes, could be hit hard. In the large parts of the north of England, the living wage has already reached 2/3 of the local median earnings, said this professor, which is actually a great start. And definitely these stimuluses, I would not underrate them. They can really help you pick up quite a few application marks, especially if you're going to talk about the example that is actually advised you to talk about, which is the social care sector. There's quite a lot of detail in the stimulus, and 100% try to utilise this. This is really easy application marks. They give you quite a few stats and figures. They contrast the new living wage compared to the old one. They tell you about the gig economy, which of course is not explicitly on the spec, but again, in live classes, why do we teach it? Since it has such a relevant link to the real world of economics, and in the real world of economics, one of the biggest things that is changing now is the gig economy and the new advancements with the gig economy. So definitely something well worth to learn. Also, here the question is referring mostly to the social care sector, then also towards the end talks about the north of England, basically regional inequalities and how the living wage has reached nearly 2/3 of local median incomes, which already thinking now could work as a really good evaluation for some of these paragraphs. But anyway, let's get started with planning the paragraph. Okay, let's get started with this first paragraph, and simply the easiest one, and the one I'm sure came to most of your minds, first things first, is of course just giving a little minimum wage analysis. Since of course there is would be wage on this axis, on the y-axis, and quantity of labour on the x-axis, since of course the minimum wage diagram itself has quite a lot of analysis, can go quite into depth with it. Of course, where's the minimum wage going to be? It's going to be above the equilibrium wage, and you could call it minimum, or it's actually called living wage in this example. So P the living wage, and of course, what does this living wage lead to? Let's see. So this is now quantity demanded, this is now quantity supplied. So now there's a discrepancy between quantity demanded and quantity supplied. And let's remember, in labour markets, who does the supplying and who does the demanding? Of course, us workers, households, supply the labour, and firms do the demanding. Firms demand the labour. Therefore, this excess supply, what does this also represent? What else can we call this excess supply? This is, of course, unemployment. And you could link this very well to something like government failure. Why is this government failure? The government intervene in the market. They set this living wage to try improve the allocation of resources. However, in reality, it leads to this excess supply. Of course, it's distorting like the price mechanism, but it leads to this excess supply, which means there's more unemployment, which actually could mean the government has made the allocation of resources worse than before. Therefore, you could define this as government failure. But we'll go into more depth with that paragraph later on. The second big paragraph I would write, which is quite interesting, and most students, I would say 90% of students would do this paragraph because it's the most simple, it's the first one that comes to your mind. But the second one, which is a really great one, and one I always emphasise in the live classes for students to have a shot at, is now. So living wage, wages are increasing for firms, and wages are a cost for firm. And what specific cost are they for a firm? Since we're talking specifically about wages, we would say this is a variable cost. Therefore, we have an increase in variable cost. Now, which diagram can we show an increase in variable costs on? Of course, we can show that on a cost/revenue diagram. Now, so we can shift our both, and of course, on a cost revenue diagram, which curves shift up when variable costs increase? You should know this by now. This is both MC and AC. So both your cost curves on a monopoly, on a cost revenue diagram, will shift upwards when you have an increase in variable cost. And this can be a really good diagrammatic analysis paragraph, including a lot of real world application. So actually, we'll get started with this paragraph and then we'll finish off with this paragraph. Okay, so we said there's an increase in variable costs, and of course, first things first, the main points in our chain of analysis will be driven, and as they should be, by our diagram. So let's get this diagram drawn. So a cost revenue diagram, and let's get this drawn. So of course, very simple diagram for the start. So D equals AR, MR, AC, and MC. Okay, and now let's get this labeled up. Of course, labeled up with the profit maximization point. MC equals MR. Pull down from there. Q mark. That's going to lead to this large box of super normal profit. Now, if a firm's variable costs increase, like we said, both MC and HC are going to shift upwards. And in this specific question, since I want to relate it a lot to the real world application, try to really base it around my real world knowledge, I am really going to emphasize that an increase in variable costs, since one of the largest costs for care homes, for social care firms, is wages. I think the statistic is around 60% of social care firms' costs are wages. So when wages increase, it has, when national living wage increases, it has a significant effect on these firms. Thus, and lots of social care firms, lots of care homes every year leave the market. They are forced to shut down since their costs are too large. So I'm going to try to represent that on this diagram. And how am I going to do that? Of course, my average costs are going to be higher than my price. Thus, that means I am higher than my shutdown point. So I've now crossed the shutdown point to the point at which a firm should leave the market. So how am I going to show that on the diagram? I'm of course going to show that by drawing my AC curve above my D equals AR curve. So that's AC1. Let's get in the new MC curve somewhere around there, which is MC1. Let's also get that new MC curve in, so MC1. So I've just made them red just to make them a bit clearer. So now let's use these new curves and work out the new profit maximization point. Of course, it's still where MC equals MR, but in this scenario now, it's where MC1 equals MR, which at this point there, we keep going up from that point until we hit our AR curve. Go left, which is now our new profit maximization point, which is Pmax1. But of course, we need to find our costs. How do we do that? We keep going up from this. We'll label this new Qmax1 quantity. We keep going up until we hit our AC curve. Now this gives us a box of what? A box, of course, our costs are now higher than our price. Therefore, this is a box of losses. Let's get started on how I would word this chain of analysis. So when you start, your point needs to be reusing as many words in the question as possible, since you want the examiner to understand you're directly addressing the question. So one disadvantage of a significant increase in the national living wage, as we can see from, and I'd quote this as application, from £8.72 in 2020 to £10.50 in 2024, is it will lead to an increase in a firm's costs. And what we show in this diagram, which therefore in the long run could lead to firms being forced to close down. As for example, and these are all stats we've learned and I've taught myself in the live classes. For example, in 2024, it's estimated that 20% of care homes are at risk of closing down, and there's around 300 care homes or social care places that close each year. So that's a really good way to get it started. Okay, let's keep going. So how would I actually start my chain of analysis now? So given my point, given my applications, how would I get started? So, and again, this is real world application just pays dividends here, and it's why the ASR students are just disproportionately, like, they're just on a different level compared to the rest of the candidates. But so around 70% of social care workers are on national living wage. This means the social care sector is highly exposed to wage floor increases. So any sort of change, any increase, like we can see here, from £8.72 to £10.50, like I said, around 70% of workers are on the national living wage. Therefore, any increase is going to significantly affect the sector. So when the government decides to increase national living wage from, like I said, £8.72 to £10.50, this is going to have a disproportionate or a massive effect, a great impact on these social care firms. And in the social care industry, in care homes, around 60% of all firms' costs are workers' wages. So it's a significant proportion of a firm's costs. Thus, when wages increase, you can label this, you can even draw a national living wage diagram just to label it up. So national living wage. So when national living wage increases, it therefore leads to, and since it's a significant proportion of a firm's costs, it therefore leads to a significant shift upwards of your MC and your AC, which we can of course relate to our diagram, thus causing our AC and MC shifting from AC and MC to AC and MC1, and then you can comment on the changes in the firm. So we've gone from a box of supernormal profit to now a box of effective losses. And of course, make sure to specify, remember, in your trade analysis, you assume your examiner has no content knowledge, you're being as step-by-step as possible. Don't just say a firm's costs increase. Say, when a firm's costs increase when MC and AC shift upwards, this could therefore lead to a firm's price being, a firm's revenue being lower than a firm's cost. This would therefore mean, in the long run, a firm, these social care firms, these care homes, would be forced to close down as their costs are now higher than their revenue. Therefore, they cannot stay open. They are above their long run shutdown point. And to back that up, you could say around 300 care homes close each year. So everything I was saying verbally there, I have just typed it up. This took me quite a long time, so hopefully this is useful. Feel free to take a screenshot of this so you can refer back to it. But now, let's move on to the evaluation stage of this paragraph. So my first evaluation point, like I say in my most popular video on my channel, is the evaluation video. And I always say, question the assumptions. Economics, you're constantly making assumptions. And in this question, what have we assumed? One of the big things we've assumed is that when a firm's costs rise, so when the variable costs rise, it will mean that a firm's revenue is now lower than a firm's costs. So the firm's costs are higher, the revenue is lower, thus they will be forced to shut down. However, that depends on how a firm sets its price. As for example, these social care firms, these care homes, when costs are rising due to wage costs rising also, they could respond to that increase in costs with an increase in prices. As for example, why was there such high levels of inflation? For example, 8 consecutive months of double-digit inflation during COVID times. That is because firms were experiencing a massive increase in costs, be it the Russia-Ukraine war, be it several factors that were causing their costs to rise. But how did the firms that survived respond? They responded by increasing prices. And when firms increase price, of course, that contributes to inflation as well. So the way I'd word this evaluation point, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree to which council social care firms rise prices in line with the rising costs. So the degree to which these social care firms pass the rising costs on to consumers. As you could also mention in this evaluation point, that definitely social care, adult care homes have a degree of inelastic demand. As for example, elderly, ill individuals, disabled individuals, they need quality care. Therefore, it means that since there's a degree of inelastic demand, how do you define inelastic demand? Is when consumers are not responsive to a change in price. Therefore, it's very unlikely that consumers will be responsive to the change in price, thus meaning, and the main thing, that these care homes, these social care firms, will be allowed to stay open, since now their prices are representing the increase in cost. So that's how I'd word that first evaluation point. And secondly, a smaller evaluation point, but definitely very relevant, especially if you're keeping up with the healthcare side of economics. One big thing is that, of course, the government will help out. They will help these social care firms. Social care is necessary. Secondary care in the UK is necessary. Therefore, it depends on the degree to which, when national living wage increases, it depends on the degree to government subsidies, how the government helps these firms out to recover or help with their costs. So not the most developed evaluation point, but definitely if you're struggling with evaluation, one you can mention. So the last evaluation point I was thinking about is really developed, and it's surrounding the lines of depends on the degree to which a firm fosters efficiency improvements. As what is this new pressure? So the new pressure is an increase in national living wage. That is going to increase a firm's costs. And essentially what's going to happen in the market, firms that cannot respond to this increase in wage are going to be wiped out. The market is wiping out firms, and specifically the inefficient firms. The firms that survive will be the efficient firms. These will be the firms that are able to respond, that are malleable. For example, they may respond by trying to increase productivity in other ways. They may respond by trying to reduce their reliance on labour. For example, we said around 60% of social care homes costs are labour, but firms could, for example, invest into things like electronic monitors, like you can get electronic blood pressure, just normal health monitors, which could decrease the degree to which these firms need labour. Thus, essentially what we're saying, it relates, of course, heavily relates to the concept of creative destruction, but firms that foster efficiency improvements will survive, whereas the firms that do not will not survive. And the way I'd word that valuation point really simply, it's a really interesting concept, especially for other questions, and especially creative destruction essays on things like contestability. It's an absolutely great point to know about. But the way I'd word this evaluation point depends on the level of efficiency improvements. As for example, if a firm invests into something like technology or like electronic monitors on the residents' health, it could severely decrease the reliance on wages. Therefore, less of a firm's costs are reliant on wages, thus they're less affected by this increase in national living wage. And that will be more than enough evaluation for this first paragraph. Let's move on to the second paragraph. So let's get started with this second paragraph. Like I said, it is just going to be a simple minimum wage paragraph, since that is of course quite apparent for this question. So of course, like I said, wage on the y-axis, quantity of labour on the x-axis. Now you can do this in quite a few different ways. You can show the two changes in national living wage. So you can show from £8.72 to £10.50. You can show it like that, but very simply, I think this works quite well as well. Just talking about the new national living wage and just basing a chain of analysis upon this. And of course, the main thing in the chain of analysis is going to be the excess supply of labour. So this can be QD, this is going to be QS, and that is going to represent the excess supply, which of course is unemployment, since we're talking about labour market. And it is quite relevant here, I believe, to also just label up the equilibrium. So the way I would go about this chain of analysis is, firstly, one other disadvantage of a significant increase in the national living wage is it will cause unemployment. As for example, in the UK, the unemployment rate as of September 2025 is 4.7%. The labour market is originally at equilibrium at WE and QE. However, the government intervenes in this labour market, in labour markets in general, in all labour markets in general, as it believes that WE, the wage at equilibrium, is too low a wage for its workers. It believes that it leaves the workers open to things like monopoly power, etc. Therefore, the government intervenes in the market. They set a national living wage, of course, which is wages for 21 individuals who are 21 and above. This wage is above the equilibrium wage, thus pushes wage up, and as we can see in the application, this pushes wage up to £10.50 in 2024. This new minimum wage leads to a disequilibrium. There is now a discrepancy between the quantity supplied of labour and the quantity demanded of labour. We can see this difference between QS and QD, and of course, which is excess supply, and excess supply in the labour market would be classed as unemployment. Thus, the government have intervened in the market to try improve the allocation of resources for workers. They are making sure the workers are not underpaid, trying to increase workers' welfare. However, in reality, you could argue, due to the mass unemployment, due to the discrepancy between QD and QS, the excess supply, the government have actually worsened the allocation of resources, thus meaning there is a disadvantage of the increase of the national living wage. Very simple paragraph, but you can take a small chain of analysis and really extend it out. Use this chain of analysis as much as possible. Use a diagram as much as possible. Like I would say, use the diagram to drive that chain of analysis. And of course, for those of you who want to specify, just add a bit more detail into here, you can of course say this unemployment is in fact a specific type of unemployment, which you don't really hear about much anymore. It's more of a classical economist type of view, but it is of course real wage or classical unemployment, where the unemployment in the market has been caused by the wage artificially being increased, of course in this scenario by the government. Now you can leave the paragraph there, and that's a very justified, especially, and it all depends on timing, to be honest. Depends how much time you have left in your exam. But now, if you look at the end of this stimulus, it is actually quite interesting. It talks specifically about the north of England, and of course we know the regional inequalities in the UK, and it talks about how living wage has already reached 2/3 of the local median earnings. So how can I include this? So for example, in the social care worker industry, it reduces the incentive for these workers to become higher skilled, to progress in their careers. For example, become a nurse, as if the national living wage increases and we're already close to the median earnings in the north, it reduces the incentive and it compresses wage differentials, and that is the main thing. And if you compress wage differentials, there's no incentive there's limited incentive for workers to progress, to pick up higher skills, as essentially they don't really need to. They're not making much less by being lower skilled. Now that point isn't necessary, but it's a great point if you fully understand it. Moving on to evaluation, I'm going to keep it quite brief, and again it's going to be embedded in real world application. So essentially the way I'm going to evaluate this is talking about the turnover in social care industry, in the care home industry, as essentially the turnover of staff in this industry is extremely high. So in reality, the higher minimum wage does not actually cause excess supply, does not cause unemployment, as the problem in the social care industry is in fact there are not enough workers to fill the vacancies. So in reality, basically, is the exact opposite problem, and the higher minimum wage is actually helping solving that the problem with the vacancy. So the higher minimum wage is meaning more people are moving into the social care, the care home industry. So more workers are entering the industry. Thus, instead of actually worsening the unemployment, is actually improving the unemployment. So the way I would word this evaluation point is, however, in evaluation, this depends on how an increased national living wage is actually leading to improvements in employment in the care home social care industry. Essentially, the problem in the social care industry isn't the excess supply. The problem is the lack of individuals who want to go into social care. So there's way too many vacancies and there's not enough workers to fill those vacancies. So by increasing the national living wage, that is actually helping the social care worker industry, the social care industry, as it means workers are now more incentivized to enter the industry. So it's having the exact opposite effect. Instead of causing more excess supply, is actually increasing and helping employment. And of course, there's lots of evaluation points for this paragraph. You could talk about productivity, as for example, the increase in wages is of course going to lead to an increase in productivity, which could offset the decrease in employment. So you could actually get more output by less workers as workers' productivity increases. But yeah, we're going to leave it there for this 25 mark question.